I would like to talk about the genesis of this particular plan here when it comes to the Economic Action Plan, as described in the budget, and titled Leading the Way on Jobs and Growth. Now, one of the things I take issue with is the fact that, okay, so the Economic Action Plan is not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's leading the way. I think by the sheer gist of our talented workforce, the education levels that we have, our ability to innovate, the capacity by which that we can get to a level that we can survive all economic crises, certainly is leading the way. So I think it's incumbent upon the individual to lead the way, certainly out of this. But there are areas in which there are weaknesses in our society, socioeconomic factors that are at play here, that as a government we need to take action on. We have to play a role in the lives of people that have fallen through the cracks, people who are most vulnerable in situations, whether they live in Ontario, whether they live in Nunavut or Newfoundland and Labrador. Many of them are going through a similar crisis when it comes to them personally, when it comes to education, when it comes to rates of literacy, certainly when it comes to matching the skills with a particular place, or certainly with a particular industry that they want to be in. One of the things I'd like to suggest for this House to consider, and it's one that I've talked about quite a bit over the past little while, and one of the things that we are now seeing that in our workforce, and I take my riding as an example, actually my riding would be a strong example, because of the talent that they have and the skills that they've developed over the past little while. A lot of the work is transient in nature. So basically you have a particular individual with a skill set that is for the oil and gas industry. Now, if you're thinking about Newfoundland and Labrador, you must be thinking that obviously they work offshore. Not the case. In my particular neck of the woods, a lot of people are transients from Newfoundland and Labrador to the oil fields of Alberta. They work in some of the major plants, in some of the upgraders, I think the term is called, to go from one form of petroleum to the final product that's ready for market. Certainly when it comes to natural gas, when it comes to oil, but also for major infrastructure projects that are happening through Alberta because of the proliferation of the industry. And I say that because, you know, even though oil prices dipped dramatically over last year, the infrastructure is in place, and the people who work this industry, they're also in place, and many of them travel back and forth. So they spend perhaps 3 or 4 weeks in Alberta at the work site, and they travel thousands of kilometers to return home for another 2 or 3 weeks. And that's becoming the nature of many of the workers and many of the jobs that are available at this point. Now, there was a dip in the demand for work simply because of the low price of oil. Well, I say low price of oil, but relative to what it was 2 years ago, when it was in cases above $150 a barrel. Now we find ourselves at $83 a barrel, and therefore we've kind of slipped into a comfortable place when it comes to achieving work for those that are skilled in that direction. So how does that change the dynamic? It does in many ways. What we are finding is that people are now taking advantage of skills training, whether it's federal or whether it's provincial, and that is a good thing. But what we're lacking is the ability for larger companies or even smaller companies, smaller medium enterprise, able to match the work that is available. What I would implore the Minister of Human Resources to consider is a national program which is similar to what you would call a skills inventory database. Let's assume for one moment that I possess a skill in pipe fitting. Now, I live in Newfoundland and Labrador, and in there I find where can I go to achieve work that allows me to stay at my home but yet travel to find work elsewhere. So what you need to do is that you need to go to a database, put yourself on the database to get your particular skill set out there. To go beyond what is your own backyard, to put into a national database, to allow other companies to see if you exist. I know that sounds like a strange concept, but really, if you are, work is now becoming so quick to attain. Industries now transitioning from the old traditional style of even the traditional industries such as oil and gas or forestry, even those industries are now transitioning. In the forestry, we're going from not just pulp and paper or newsprint. We're transforming into furniture making, pellets for energy, whether it's at the home or at the business. Heating energy, I mean. Fishing, smaller boats. Many of them are now becoming larger vessels. Fishing in areas further offshore. So that puts us in a position where, because these companies, and whether they be small or big, they're transitioning to a new type of work and a new type of business model, new types of revenue streams. By doing that, it becomes problematic to find the workers involved who have the particular skills. And they spend a lot of money and resources and time just to find that person. But we as a government can make that transition easier by providing that particular database of information. So it puts the worker as well as the employer into that same sphere. It allows them to communicate. And not only that, here's the other side of doing that, which would be beneficial. And I humbly put this forward to the House as a token of debate. Here's what you can say. If a small community, such as, and I'll give you a good example, and that is Port Union in my riding. There were over 1,000 people that used to work at the local shrimp plant, which at the time was owned by Fisheries Products International, now owned by OCI. They went from a workforce of over 1,000 people down to about 100, maybe 200 on a good day. Highly seasonal, perhaps attaining somewhere between 15 to 20 weeks of work for the average employee. But now, across the way, and when I say across the way, I mean across the harbor, there's an old plant. It's basically, it existed many, many years ago, the early part of the last century. And it was the focal point of an industry of fishery when there were a lot more people involved in the fishery. Well, obviously, and it was owned by William Coker, incidentally, and it was shut down, and the government is now investing into giving the place a facelift, we'll say, making it more user-friendly, not just for tourists, but also for business. And now, a company such as Iceberg is now going to produce bottled water. Bottled water from Iceberg. My goodness. I remember a gentleman telling me one time, he said, you know, in my day, icebergs were the biggest nuisance around. Now icebergs have become a lifeline for bottled water and other products. So, how do you go from transitioning from what was all fishery to now partially fishery and partially iceberg harvesting? Well, you do that in the way that we spoke about, by trying to find the talented individuals who are able to work. So the skill set has to be there in order for them to set up. So if a database exists, a company that wants to set up an operation such as Iceberg or such as a water bottling plant, they can get a good idea about who in that community is available to work. Whether they've moved away recently or not, they can still be involved in that database, simply where they come from. So that makes it much easier for a company to do that. Mining is another example. There is a huge mine that opened up outside of a town called Millertown. It's owned by Teck. Mostly copper, nickel, zinc, and now they're looking and mining for gold. By doing that, they need the particular individuals talented enough to work in those mines. So that's where the government could play a role in that. I would like for the government to consider that in their next budget, or even over as a policy over the summer and the fall, to realize that we have, if we're going to get serious about a talented workforce and promoting a talented workforce and making sure that workforce is able to mesh with anybody who wants to hire them, whether it be small or medium or large business, we have to make the playing field by which they can come together. So let me return to this budget and the implementation and basically what was written in the book that was provided to us when the budget was released. The Economic Action Plan promised a great deal of money for infrastructure. It promised a great deal on the back end for tertiary activity. And here is where the intention is, I guess, paved with gold, if I may use the vernacular. But the problem with that is that the function of it has diminished in the past little while. And here is some of the problems with this that we need to consider when this type of crisis happens again. Unspent monies. Let me just give the House a list of what was unspent in this particular situation.